She lived her life by the clock and by the blueprint. Every minute of her day was a scheduled block, a line item in a meticulously constructed plan. From her corner office on the 70th floor, she could see the city sprawling out below, a grid of streets and buildings that she, in a way, had helped to shape. Her company was a titan in the world of software and logistics, a name whispered in boardrooms across the globe. She had built it from the ground up after her husband's sudden passing, channeling her grief into a ferocious, unrelenting drive for control. In her world, chaos was the enemy, and unpredictability was a flaw to be eliminated. Her name was Eleanor, and her world was one of sharp lines, glass surfaces, and absolute order. This need for control extended far beyond her business. It seeped into the very foundation of her home, a sprawling, modern mansion perched on a hill overlooking the city. The house was less of a home and more of a high-security fortress, with walls of glass that looked out onto perfectly manicured lawns, yet were impenetrable from the outside. Every window was wired, every door had a code, and a network of discrete cameras monitored every perimeter. Inside, the air was always a perfect, cool temperature. The floors were made of cold, sleek marble that echoed the slightest sound, a constant reminder of the house's vast, sterile emptiness. For Eleanor, this was safety. This was peace. Her entire world, her entire reason for being, revolved around two people, her daughters, 10-year-old Chloe and 8-year-old Sophie. They were her heart, her soul, and her greatest, most paralyzing fear. Both girls had been blind since birth, a fact that had shattered Eleanor's world and then rebuilt it into a fortress of protection. In her mind, their world was one of perpetual darkness, of constant danger. They couldn't see a stray step on the stairs, a sharp corner on a table, or a stranger's approaching shadow. So she had removed all the dangers. The furniture was soft-edged and placed with mathematical precision. The stairs were replaced with gentle, sloping ramps. A team of carefully vetted caregivers, rotating in precise shifts, ensured the girls were never, ever alone. They had every resource money could buy, the best tutors, the most advanced audio learning systems, and a wardrobe full of the softest, most comfortable clothes. Yet, for all the luxury, their world was small. It was the sound of the same caregiver's voice, the feel of the same plush carpet under their feet, the scent of the same lemon polish used on the endless floors. Their canes, which they used with a confident, tapping rhythm, were their explorers, mapping out a familiar, unchanging territory. They knew the number of steps from their bedroom to the kitchen, the texture of the tiles in the bathroom, the exact weight of their favorite audiobook player. They were happy in their own way, laughing together over stories they listened to for the 100th time, their hands finding each other's easily in the large, quiet rooms. But they were also contained, living in a gilded cage built from their mother's love and fear. So, when the invitation came for the Global Tech Summit in Singapore, a week-long event that was crucial for a multi-billion-dollar merger, Eleanor felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Canceling was not an option. This merger would secure her company's future, and by extension, her daughter's future. But leaving them for 7 days and 7 nights felt impossible. The thought of it, the sheer unpredictability of it, made her hands feel cold. She spent a week preparing. First, she hired a new caregiver, a woman with impeccable references and a calm, professional demeanor named Maria. Eleanor interviewed her 3 times, running exhaustive background checks and posing dozens of hypothetical scenarios. What if Sophie has a nightmare? What if Chloe refuses to take her medicine? What if the power goes out? Maria answered each question with a patient confidence that finally, just barely soothed Eleanor's frayed nerves, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed to see them. That's when she found the solution. A new, state-of-the-art home security system. It wasn't just about alarms and motion detectors. It came with a series of high-definition cameras with crystal-clear audio, all accessible from a single, secure application on her tablet. She had them installed in every room the girls would frequent their playroom, the living room, the kitchen, and even the backyard garden. The technician, a young man who seemed intimidated by her intensity, assured her the system was military grade. "No one gets in without you knowing, ma'am," he had said. But that wasn't the point. The point was that she could get in, digitally. She could be there, even when she was thousands of miles away. The day she left, she went through her final checklist. She hugged the girls, her embrace a little too tight, a little too long. "Be good for Maria," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she refused to show. "Mommy will be watching you." Chloe and Sophie nodded, used to their mother's intense way of loving them. As the car pulled away, Eleanor already had her tablet out, her thumb opening the app. There they were, small figures in the vast living room, sitting on the sofa with Maria as she read them a story. She could see the gentle rise and fall of their shoulders, hear the soft cadence of Maria's voice. A wave of relief washed over her. She could still control it. She could still keep them safe. Meanwhile, in a completely different world, a man named David was starting his afternoon shift. He was the janitor at the girls' private school, a job that afforded him a certain kind of invisibility. People saw his cart, smelled the faint scent of cleaning supplies, and heard the squeak of his worn-out sneakers on the polished floors, but they rarely saw him. He was a single father, with a quiet face and kind eyes that seemed to carry a heavy, but gentle, sadness. He moved through the grand hallways of the school like a ghost, his presence a soft hum in the background of the privileged lives that unfolded around him. He often saw Chloe and Sophie. He'd watch them navigate the long corridors with their canes, their heads held high, their faces turned toward the sounds of the school. He saw the other children, loud and rushing, sometimes bumping into them without a second thought. He saw the way the teachers and aides fussed over them, their voices often a little too loud, a little too full of pity. David never pitied them. He saw something else in them. He saw a strength, a different way of being in the world that was, to him, just as valid as anyone else's. He'd hold a door open for them without making a big deal out of it. Just a quiet, afternoon ladies, as they passed. One time, little Sophie had tripped over a backpack someone had left on the floor. Before the aides could even react, David was there. He didn't scoop her up or make a fuss. He simply knelt, his old work pants making a soft sound on the floor. "Hey there," he said, his voice low and calm. "Let's see what we have here." He gently helped her sit up, his hands finding her shoulders to steady her. "Nothing broken. Just a little adventure for the day, huh?" Sophie had stopped crying, her head turning toward his voice, a small, trusting smile forming on her lips. To Eleanor, he was just a part of the background, a nameless uniform in a school she paid a fortune for. But to the girls, he was already becoming something more. He was the quiet man who smelled of soap and kindness, the one who didn't shout. The silence in her Singapore hotel suite was a different kind of quiet than the one at home. At home, the silence was heavy, filled with the hum of high-tech appliances and the constant, unspoken promise of security. Here, the silence was foreign and thin. It was the sound of a city 12 time zones away, a city that was sleeping while she was wide awake. The only light in the darkened room came from the tablet in her hands, its glow illuminating her face, etching lines of worry around her eyes. Eleanor had successfully closed the first day of the summit, shaking hands and smiling for the cameras, a picture of control and success. But now, in the dead of night, her real work began. She opened the app, the one with the simple, unassuming icon of a house. A grid of 4 camera feeds appeared. The living room, dark and empty. The kitchen, a sterile landscape of steel and stone. The girls' bedroom, where 2 small forms were still under their covers, the gentle rise and fall of their chests, a silent rhythm on the screen. And finally, the backyard garden. This was her favorite view, her connection to them when she couldn't be there. During the day, it was a canvas of green and gold, a place where they could feel the sun without the dangers of the outside world. The first few days, the ritual was a comfort. She'd watch them wake up, see Maria help them get ready, and follow their progress through the house. It was like directing a play where she knew all the lines and all the cues. But on the 3rd day, she noticed something. A small, imperceptible flaw in her perfect design. After their school bus dropped them off at the end of the long driveway, there was a gap. A full 60 minutes where the girls were alone in the house before Maria's scheduled arrival. Eleanor had planned it this way, thinking a little independence, a little time to decompress from school in their own space would be good for them. But watching it unfold on screen, it felt different. It felt like a vulnerability. On the first day, she watched them go into the garden. They sat on the stone bench, their canes resting beside them, their faces turned up to the afternoon sun. They were talking to each other, their heads close together, sharing a secret world of sound and touch. Eleanor felt a pang of guilt. They were fine. They were more than fine. They were thriving in their own quiet way. She was the one who was afraid, but on the second day, as she watched the feed from a conference room during a coffee break, she saw it. A flicker of movement at the very edge of the property, where the tall, wrought iron fence met the thick line of oak trees. It was just a blur, really. A deer, maybe. A trick of the light? She zoomed in, the image becoming a pixelated mess. Nothing. She shook her head, telling herself she was being paranoid. The stress of the summit was getting to her. On the third day, she was back in her hotel room, intentionally timing her observation to that 1-hour window. She told herself she was just being a good mother, double-checking. But her heart was beating a little faster. And then she saw him. He wasn't a blur. He was a person. A man in a dark, worn work jacket, standing just beyond the fence, half hidden by the shadows of the trees. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there, watching. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers flew to the screen, trying to sharpen the image, to get a better look. The man was facing the house, his posture still. He looked familiar. The shape of his shoulders, the way he stood with his head slightly bowed. And then it clicked. The school. The quiet hallways. The cart of cleaning supplies. It was the janitor, the man she'd seen a handful of times. A background figure in the polished world of her daughter's education. What was he doing here? Her mind, a finely tuned machine for assessing risk and eliminating variables, began to spin. The school was 5 miles away. This was not a shortcut. This was not a coincidence. He had sought out her house. He had found the one spot on the property where the cameras gave a slightly obscured view. He was targeting them. The thought hit her like a physical blow, a cold wave washing over her. Her girls, blind and trusting, sitting just 100 feet away from a potential predator. And she was powerless, a ghost on a screen. She wanted to scream, to call the local police, but she was thousands of miles away. What would she even say? There's a man standing on a public road near my fence? They would laugh at her. She had to handle this herself. She had to know. The most terrifying part was the girls' reaction. They weren't scared. When the man appeared, they didn't flinch. Instead, they both turned their heads in his direction, as if they had heard a familiar sound. Chloe even stood up, her head cocked to the side, a small, almost curious expression on her face. It made no sense. Eleanor's fear told her they were just naive, unable to comprehend the danger. They couldn't see the threat, so they didn't know it was there. Their calmness was not a sign of safety. It was a sign of their vulnerability. The next day, she was glued to the screen. She had canceled a dinner meeting, feigning a headache. She couldn't concentrate on business anyway. Her entire world had shrunk to this one, grainy camera feed. He was there again. Same time, same spot. This time, he moved. He took a few steps closer to the fence, his movements slow and deliberate. Eleanor's knuckles were white as she gripped the tablet. She felt like she was watching a horror movie, screaming at the characters to run, but no sound came out. He knelt down. And then he did the unthinkable. He slipped his hand through one of the decorative gaps in the iron fence. It was a bold, brazen move. Chloe, who had been waiting for it, walked right up to the fence. Eleanor's heart stopped. She watched, frozen in horror, as her daughter reached out her small hand and took something from his palm. It was tiny. The camera couldn't pick it up. It looked like a small stone or a folded piece of paper. He said something to them, his voice too far away for the microphone to pick up. They nodded, and then he was gone, melting back into the trees as silently as he had appeared, a clandestine exchange. That's what it was. There was no other explanation. A secret message. A token, a promise. Eleanor's mind raced through a dozen terrifying scenarios. Was he part of a larger plot? Was he grooming them? Was this how it started? The cold fear that had been pooling in her stomach now turned to a hot, hard anger. This was no longer just a fear. It was a confirmation. Her worst instincts had been right. Her daughters were in danger, and the one person who was supposed to be protecting them, their caregiver, wasn't even there. She was just a woman on a screen, watching it all happen. She had to go home, now. The tablet felt cold and heavy in her hands, a window into a nightmare unfolding in real time. For a long moment she just stared at the blank space where the man had been, her mind refusing to process what her eyes had just seen. The image of her daughter's small hand reaching out, taking something from a stranger, was burned onto the back of her eyelids. The quiet hum of the hotel's air conditioning suddenly sounded like a threat, the sterile luxury of the room feeling like a cage. A surge of hot, raw adrenaline shot through her, melting the fear into a white-hot rage. This was not a random event. This was a violation. She began to pace, the plush carpet swallowing the sound of her frantic steps. Back and forth, from the window overlooking the glittering Singapore skyline to the door, as if she could somehow walk the 12,000 miles back home. Her mind, usually a sharp, logical tool, was now a chaotic storm of terrifying possibilities. What was in his hand? A note with instructions? A tiny, folded packet of something sinister? A microdot? The movies she'd seen, the thrillers she'd dismissed as fantasy, now played out in her head with vivid, horrifying detail. He was grooming them. That was the word. He was earning their trust, making them see him as a friend before he... She couldn't even finish the thought. She stopped pacing and grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking so badly she had to try 3 times to unlock it. She couldn't call the police in her city. What would she say? I think a man is looking at my kids? They would tell her to call back if he actually did something. She needed proof. She needed a name. She needed to know who he was. The school. She'd call the headmistress of the school. The call connected after 3 rings. A cheerful, professional voice answering. Northwood Academy, how may I help you? This is Eleanor Vance, she said, her voice tight, struggling to maintain the composure of a CEO and not sound like a hysterical mother. I need some information immediately about one of your staff members. A janitor. There was a slight pause on the other end. Of course, Mrs. Vance. Is there an issue? Just tell me his name, Eleanor demanded, her patience gone. The man, quiet, works the afternoons. I need his full name and employment file, now. The headmistress, flustered by the urgency, quickly pulled up the information. That would be David Miller, Mrs. Vance. He's been with us for 3 years. Honestly, he's one of our most reliable employees. Never a single complaint. In fact, the children are quite fond of him. He has a very gentle way. Every word the headmistress said was like fuel on Eleanor's fire. Asterisk fond of him, gentle. It was a perfect cover. He was that good at deception. Email me his file. Everything you have. Home address, emergency contact, the works, she snapped, and hung up without waiting for a reply. The email arrived a few minutes later. David Miller. Single father. Lived in a small apartment on the other side of town. Emergency contact, a sister. It all looked so normal, so mundane. It was the perfect disguise for a predator. There was nothing in his file that screamed threat, which to Eleanor made him an even greater threat. He was a ghost, a man who had learned to blend in, to be seen as harmless. And he had set his sights on her daughters, that was it. The summit, the merger, the billion-dollar deal, it all turned to dust in her mind. None of it mattered. Her world had shrunk to the size of that backyard garden, and it was under attack. She wasn't going to wait for him to make his next move. She was going to stop him. She threw a few essentials into her leather suitcase, not bothering to fold them. The expensive silk blouses and tailored pants looked ridiculous now, like costumes for a life she no longer recognized. She booked the first flight home, a red-eye that would get her there in the morning. Every second she spent packing, booking, and traveling was a second he could be getting closer to her girls. The powerlessness was suffocating. She was a woman who could move markets with a single statement, but she couldn't protect her own children from a distance. The ride to the airport was a blur of city lights she didn't see. The terminal was a cacophony of noise and strangers, and for the first time, she felt a prickle of fear in public. Every face seemed to hold a secret, every glance felt menacing. She kept her head down, her phone clutched in her hand, a useless brick without an internet connection. On the plane, crammed into a first-class seat that felt too small, she was trapped. The flight attendants offered her champagne and hot towels, but she just stared out the window into the endless darkness. The hum of the engines a constant reminder of how far away she was. She closed her eyes, but all she could see was the grainy CCTV footage. She played it over and over in her mind. The man's hand slipping through the fence. Chloe's confident walk toward him. The trusting way she accepted the object. It was a scene of pure innocence, but through the lens of her fear, it was a conspiracy. She had failed them. She had built a fortress, but she had left a crack in the wall, a 1-hour window of vulnerability that a predator had crawled through. She would never make that mistake again. She would surround them with so much protection, they wouldn't be able to breathe. It was a terrible thought, but in her current state, it felt like the only way to keep them safe. As the plane began its descent. The first light of dawn creeping over the horizon, a cold determination settled over her. The panic was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. She was no longer just a scared mother watching a screen. She was a hunter coming home to protect her cubs. She had a plan. She wouldn't go in the front door. That would alert the caregiver, and he might be gone before she could confront him. She needed to catch him in the act. She took a taxi from the airport, but had the driver drop her off at the end of her long, tree-lined street. The air was cool and damp, smelling of wet earth and morning. She walked the rest of the way, her expensive heels sinking slightly into the soft grass of the verge. She slipped through a side gate, one that was always left unlocked for the gardeners, and moved like a shadow along the tall hedge that bordered the property. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her movements were calm and deliberate, and then she heard them, voices, soft, calm voices drifting from the garden. One was a man's, low and gentle. The others were her daughters, their tones relaxed, even happy. The sound of their laughter sent a fresh wave of fury through her. How could they laugh? Didn't they know the danger they were in? She crept closer, parting the thick leaves of the hedge just enough to see. And there he was. The janitor, David Miller, kneeling by the iron fence just as he had been on the video. And there were her girls sitting on the stone bench not 10 feet away from him, smiling. That was it. She had seen enough. The rage she had been bottling for the entire flight exploded. She burst out from behind the hedge, her voice a raw, terrified scream that tore through the peaceful morning air. "Get away from them! Now!" she yelled, holding up her phone as if it were a weapon. "Don't move! I'm calling the police." The scream ripped through the quiet morning, sharp and violent, like a shard of glass breaking the peace of the garden. The birds that had been singing in the oak trees fell silent. The man at the fence, David, flinched as if he had been struck, stumbling back from the iron bars, his face a mask of pure shock. He raised his hands, not in defiance, but in a gesture of surrender and confusion. But it was the reaction of her daughters that stopped Eleanor's heart cold. They didn't scream. They didn't cry. They didn't run to her for safety. Instead, they both jumped to their feet. And Chloe, her older daughter, actually took a step toward her mother, her small hands held out as if to push the terrible sound away. "Mommy, no!" she cried, her voice not filled with fear of the man by the fence, but with fear of her mother's rage. "You don't understand." Sophie ran to her, not to Eleanor, but to her sister, clutching Chloe's leg, her face buried against her sister's dress. Her small shoulders were shaking. Eleanor stood there, her phone still held high like a weapon, her chest heaving, completely bewildered. This was not how it was supposed to happen. They were supposed to be scared, relieved that their mother had come to save them. They were supposed to see the monster she saw. "Get behind me now," Eleanor commanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and a strange, new fear. "This wasn't right. No," Chloe shouted back, her voice surprisingly strong. "He's our friend, Mommy." "You're scaring us." The word friend hit Eleanor like a physical blow. It was so absurd, so impossible, that for a second she thought her daughter must be confused. But the conviction in Chloe's voice, the way Sophie clung to her for protection from her, was undeniable. Her carefully constructed world of threat and danger was starting to fray at the edges. David, seeing the genuine terror in the girls' faces, finally found his voice. It was quiet, but it cut through the tension in the air. "Ma'am," he said softly, his hands still held up, palms open. "Please, it's okay. I promise you, I would never ever hurt your girls." His calmness was infuriating. It felt like a trick, a performance. "Don't you dare speak to me," Eleanor spat, her eyes darting between his face and her daughter's distressed ones. "I saw you. I have it on camera. Every day. The secret. The hand through the fence. What did you give her? What did you give my daughter?" Chloe let go of her sister and walked over to her mother. She gently took Eleanor's free hand, the one that wasn't clutching the phone. Her touch was hesitant but firm. "He's teaching us, Mommy," she said, her voice now soft, pleading. "He's teaching us to talk with our hands." Eleanor looked down at her daughter, then back at the man. Talk with their hands? It made no sense. They weren't deaf. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, the anger in her voice starting to be replaced by a deep, confusing dread. That's when David decided to risk it all. He slowly lowered his hands and took a small step closer, stopping at a respectful distance. He looked at Eleanor, but his words were for her to understand her children. "My son," he began, his voice gentle and steady. "My boy, he can't speak. He was born that way. He doesn't have a voice." He paused, letting the words sink in. Eleanor stared at him, her mind racing. A son who couldn't speak? What did that have to do with anything? "I see your girls at school," he continued, his eyes kind, filled with a sadness that felt genuine. "I see how they use their hands. They touch everything. They feel the world. Their hands. They're their eyes, in a way. And I see them sometimes, trying to talk to each other without making a sound so the other kids won't stare. They have their own secrets." Eleanor thought of the countless times she had watched them on the monitor. Their heads close together, their hands moving, creating a silent world that she could see but never enter. She always thought it was just a game. "I know a little bit of sign language," David said. "Not much, just what I've learned to talk to my son. And I thought maybe they would like to learn too. A way to have their own secret language that no one else knew. A way to talk across a room or in the dark without a sound." The story was so unexpected, so utterly bizarre that Eleanor's mind refused to accept it. It was a lie. It had to be. A cover story. "So you just decided to teach them? Out of the goodness of your heart? A stranger?" "I know how it looks," he said, his voice filled with an ache of understanding. "I know it looks wrong. I thought about that. But I also saw their loneliness. I saw a little bit of my son in them. And I had to try. I never touched them. I never came onto the property. I just taught them a few signs from right here." "The exchange," Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw you give her something, yesterday. What was it?" Chloe opened her hand. In her palm was a small, dark object. It wasn't a note or a drug. It was a little piece of wood, carved into the shape of a star. It was smooth and polished from handling. "He carves them for us," Chloe explained, her fingers tracing the points of the star. "This one means friend. Sophie has a heart that means love. He gives us a new one when we learn a new word, so we can feel it, so we can remember." Eleanor stared at the small wooden star. She slowly lowered her phone, the screen now dark. She reached out with a trembling hand and took the star from her daughter's palm. It was warm from Chloe's hand, and the wood was incredibly smooth, obviously sanded with great care. There were no sharp edges, no splinters. It was an object of pure, gentle intention. A predator wouldn't take the time to sand a piece of wood until it was soft as a river stone. A monster wouldn't carve a star to mean friend, the fortress of fear and certainty she had built around herself began to crumble, not brick by brick, but all at once in a great, catastrophic landslide. The CCTV footage she had watched, the scenarios she had imagined, the background checks she had run, it all flashed before her, but now it looked different, through a new lens. The man wasn't stalking. He was waiting. The girls weren't naive. They were learning. The secret exchange wasn't sinister. It was a gift. A wave of shame so profound and so powerful washed over her that it almost brought her to her knees. She, a woman who prided herself on seeing the truth, on analyzing data and making logical decisions, had been completely blind. She had seen a poor man, a janitor, and her prejudice had done the rest. She had seen his kindness as a trick, his generosity as a threat. She had let her wealth and her fear create a monster where there was only a father trying to share a little bit of light. Tears began to stream down her face, hot and unstoppable. They weren't tears of relief, but of deep, humbling regret. She looked at David, really looked at him for the first time. She saw the tired lines around his eyes, the worn fabric of his jacket, the gentle, patient way he stood there, waiting for her to understand. She looked at her daughters, who were not victims, but vibrant, intelligent children who had found a friend on their own terms. She took a shaky step forward, then another, until she was standing in front of him. She couldn't speak. The words were caught in her throat, choked by the weight of her mistake. She just held out the small wooden star, her hand trembling. David looked at the star, then at her tear-streaked face. He didn't look angry or triumphant. He just looked sad for her. He gently closed her fingers around the star. "You keep that one," he said softly. "It's for you, too. It means friend." And in that moment, the rich mom and the single dad janitor were just two parents, bound by the simple, powerful desire to give their children a better world. And Eleanor finally understood that the world she had built for her daughters wasn't better. It was just smaller. This man, with his quiet kindness and his small wooden stars, had made their world bigger, and he had done it for free. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. It was a silence filled with the weight of a misunderstanding, a silence where a mother's world had been shattered and rebuilt in the space of a few heartbeats. Eleanor stood there, the small wooden star clutched in her hand, its smooth surface a stark contrast to the raw, jagged edges of her own emotions. The tears she had cried were tears of shame, but now a new kind of warmth was spreading through her chest, a slow, dawning realization of the incredible gift she had almost destroyed. She looked at David, this quiet man she had labeled a threat, and saw only kindness in his tired eyes. He wasn't judging her. He was just waiting, giving her the space to process the monumental shift in her reality. Her daughters, no longer afraid, stood between them, a bridge connecting two separate worlds. Chloe's hand was still resting on her arm, a steady, reassuring presence. I am so sorry," Eleanor finally managed to say, her voice thick and broken. The words felt inadequate, a tiny drop in an ocean of her regret. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." She looked from David to her girls, her gaze sweeping over them, trying to memorize this moment, this feeling of being utterly humbled and completely forgiven. "I saw what I wanted to see, what I was afraid of. I didn't see you. I didn't see what you were doing for them." David gave a small, gentle nod. "It's easy to be afraid for them," he said, his voice full of a compassion she didn't deserve. "The world can be a scary place." "But I made it scarier," she whispered. "I built a cage around them and called it love." The admission felt like a confession, a release of a burden she had been carrying for years. She had been so focused on protecting her daughters from the dangers of the world that she had forgotten to teach them how to live in it. An impulse, born from a desperate need to do something, to fix this in some small way, took over. "Please," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its old strength, though it was softer now, more human. "Let me repay you for your time, for your kindness. I can set up a trust fund for your son. The best care, the best schools. Anything he needs. It's the least I can do." She expected him to hesitate, perhaps to negotiate. In her world, every act of kindness had a price. Every favor was a transaction. But David just shook his head, a sad smile touching his lips. "My son doesn't need your money, ma'am. He has everything he needs. He has me." He paused, then looked at Chloe and Sophie, who were watching him with adoring eyes. "But there is something you could do for me." "Anything," Eleanor said, her voice eager. "Learn with them," he said simply. "Don't just watch them. Be a part of their world. Let them teach you. That would be the greatest gift you could give me." And then his request hung in the air, so simple yet so profound. It wasn't about money or status. It was about time. It was about connection. It was the one thing she had in abundance but had never truly given them. "Yes," she breathed, the word a promise. "Of course, yes." In the days that followed, the house began to change. It was a slow, almost imperceptible transformation at first. The high-tech security system was still there, the cameras still watched over the rooms, but their purpose had shifted. They were no longer the eyes of a suspicious guard, but the memory keepers of a family learning to live again. Eleanor found herself leaving her tablet on the kitchen counter instead of clutching it in her hand. She was too busy. David started coming over, not in secret, but openly, through the front door. He would bring his son Liam, a quiet boy with a bright, expressive face and hands that moved with a graceful, fluid language of their own. The first time Liam visited, Eleanor felt a pang of her old anxiety. But when she saw the way her daughters' faces lit up, the way they sat with Liam on the floor, their hands moving in a silent, joyful conversation, her fear melted away into awe. She saw the bond they shared, a community built not on sight or sound, but on a deeper understanding. She insisted on learning too. It was awkward and frustrating at first. Her fingers, which could type 100 words a minute and sign million-dollar contracts, felt clumsy and stiff. David was a patient teacher, and her daughters were even more so. They would laugh when she got a sign wrong, their giggles filling the once silent hallways. They would take her hands in theirs and guide her, their small fingers shaping hers into the correct positions. She was no longer the all-knowing CEO, the untouchable matriarch. She was a student learning a new language from her children. One afternoon, she was trying to sign the word story. She kept messing it up, her hands moving in a jerky, confused motion. Sophie, her younger daughter, came and stood in front of her. She took Eleanor's hands in her own and placed them on her own chest, then moved them in the correct, flowing motion. Then Sophie looked up at her, her sightless eyes seeming to see right into her mother's soul, and she signed the word back, followed by another sign Eleanor had just learned, love. In that moment, holding her daughter's hands, Eleanor understood. This was the security she had been searching for. It wasn't in the cameras or the alarms or the tall fences. It was in this connection, this shared moment of learning and love. It was in the feeling of her daughter's small, trusting hands in hers, months later. On a warm, sunny afternoon, Eleanor sat in her home office, the tablet on her desk. Out of habit, she opened the camera app. The screen showed the backyard garden. It was no longer a perfectly manicured, sterile space. It was alive. There were blankets on the grass and half-finished art projects scattered on the patio. And in the middle of it all, sitting on a blanket, were her two daughters, David and his son Liam. They were all laughing, their hands flying in a beautiful, silent dance of conversation. David was telling a story, his face animated, and the children were captivated, their expressions rapt with attention. Eleanor watched, a smile spreading across her face. She wasn't looking for threats. She wasn't checking for dangers. She was just watching her family. She had learned that the most unbelievable thing the single dad, Janitor, did wasn't that he had secretly taught her daughters a new language. It was that he had taught her how to see. He had shown her that a world without sight could be full of vision, and that the greatest riches weren't in a bank account, but in the connections you make when you finally decide to open the door.